So this is one of two lectures where I'm going over APA papers. Um, each one probably contains a little bit of a different way to look at it, and I do suggest that you listen to both of them um, because this is an important part of the class. Though we're not writing an APA paper, an important part of statistics and methodology in the social sciences, specifically psychology, is an understanding of APA style and how to read an APA paper. So the purposes of kind of going over this is familiarity with the APA style, so understanding how to write an APA paper, but more importantly, reading and summarizing previous research. So understanding what has been done in the past. We don't want to redo research that's already been done. We want to be actually adding to the bricks of science, if you will. We're wanting to add upon what's already been done. So we're going to be doing that by looking at previous research, creating research questions and hypotheses that are logically supported by that previous research. And then within the paper, we need to both be able to communicate what methods we used, but also understand the method sections that others have used. We want to make sure that we're presenting results objectively, but also understanding how to read result sections, and then how to interpret those results back to research, both past and present, and finally, how to properly cite all of the various papers that we're referring to so that we can avoid plagiarism. Additionally, the real purpose of understanding APA papers is a general understanding of the scientific method. Learning by doing, learning by understanding, and becoming a better consumer of research. The goal here is for each of you to become a researcher. Whether you continue in an academic career where you're actually conducting academic research, or you're just basically understanding how to interpret research findings in your own practice. Whether you go on to management, whether you go on to working with others, all of these things can start to help you understand better. Let's say that you're in a workplace and you're having a problem with a leader. What does the literature on leadership say? What's the actual, not what has been written in the Wall Street Journal, but what's the actual studies about how to behave in this situation? So there's a lot of applications to basically allow us to turn science into practice, regardless of where our careers take us. So let's talk about the APA paper in general, some of the things that we'd want to know about it and to both write it and to understand it ourselves. So first is just the core concept of an APA paper. 1-inch margins on all sides. Everything is double spaced with no additional spaces. The font is always 12 point Times New Roman throughout the entire paper. And every page should have a page number. And again, APA style, and I'll say this here and I'll say it otherwise, it does get revised, so APA style changes every 2 to 3 years or so. There's usually a new edition. I think we're on the 7th edition the last I checked. It may even be further than that. I'm familiar with the 5th edition, and there's small changes, but these seem to be fairly consistent across the board when writing an APA style paper. So if we're writing that paper, the first thing is going to be a title page. There's going to be a descriptive title, which generally is going to involve our constructs and the expected relationship between them. It's one of the reasons why a lot of academic papers are kind of boringly titled. The titles are meant to tell us something about what's contained therein. After that's going to be author's name centered, including middle initials. There's then going to be institutional affiliations and properly formatted running head left adjusted. And again, you can check various sources on how APA is currently asking for this to be done. What should be noted is that the running head on the title page is not going to be the same as the page numbers on the paper throughout. And that can often be a little bit of challenge depending on your word processor. So again, just making sure we do that. Now, what this also tells us about reading academic research is rarely are we going to actually see an APA paper in this style. It's usually going to be published in a journal. But what it does tell us is that we want to make sure if the title is a teaser, if it really doesn't tell us what the paper is about, it's probably not an academic work. Also, if the authors aren't immediately listed, and usually multiple authors by their full names, I would also start to question, is this an actual empirical science article? And especially if there's no institutional affiliation information provided. So those are 3 things that we can use just right off the bat to start to determine if an article we're reading is more of a news piece or if it's an actual research paper. The abstract is often written last, and it will be after the title page. The title for this is usually abstract, center, bolded across the top of the page. And it basically is usually about 150 words, though depending on the journal, it may be more or less. It briefly introduces the topic and thinking about the actual constructs, 2 to 3 sentences at most. There's a brief methodology. Who was it done to? What was done? How was it done? This is, again, usually only 2 or 3 sentences. The actual hypotheses or key hypotheses that were tested, and a brief discussion of what was found and any conclusions therein. Again, you're not going to capture the entire paper in the abstract, but you should be able to give people a pretty good idea of what you did and what you found in that abstract. And by the way, the abstract is a great way to very quickly determine, is a paper worth continuing to read. So if you're specifically looking for research on anxiety and depression, the abstract will probably make it clear from beyond the title whether or not this is a good paper to read. So the introduction is actually not titled the introduction. It is titled the actual title of the paper. So the same thing that was on the title page, center and bolded. Generally, we're going to have an interesting open paragraph or two that introduces the problem being studied, mentions constructs and relationships. So what is this paper actually about? Then there's going to be information and background research about the construct or constructs that are involved in the study with citations throughout. Continuing, information is to set up the hypothesis or hypotheses with citations. Why should there be a relationship between the various constructs based on the previous research? The hypotheses with theory clearly stated is typically at the end of the introduction. However, sometimes there's enough hypotheses that they may be throughout the actual introduction section. In other words, they may be throughout. There might be a section on depression followed by 2 or 3 hypotheses about depressions in this sample. There then might be a section about anxiety, and again, specific hypotheses about anxiety. And finally, there might be the relationship between the two and additional hypotheses. Different journals prefer different ways of this being done, and actually different academics prefer. Some of them, like myself, prefer all the hypotheses at the end because they're easy to find and easy to reference. Some people, though, want the hypotheses directly connected to the parts of the literature review that are supporting them with past theory and past research. The method section is next, method centered and bolded at the beginning of this section. We generally open the method section with a participant section, which includes an adequate description of the participants, including who they were, and statistics about any demographics collected. So this would be where we have descriptive statistics describing our population sample. We might have average age and standard deviation. If they're college students, we might have how many were freshmen versus juniors versus seniors. We might have the ethnicity breakdown of our particular sample. We might have the geographic breakdown. Anything that we collected that we thought was relevant should be presented in this section, along with the total number of participants. If for any reason there were any participants that we decided to exclude from the study, this is where we might also list them as well. For example, we might have at the end of the section 3 participants were actually removed because, and you'd define why. The next part of the method section is materials. This includes a thorough description of any measures with examples where they're open, where the question's open-ended, if closed, what kind of scale was used. Any details about the construction of the surveys would go here as well. So basically, under the materials, everything that we use in our study, each type of measure we use to measure a construct, each manipulation that we do, anything that occurs in the study that requires some form of material would be described in this section. And then we have the procedure section. This actually includes detail of how the data was collected and sampled. So this is basically walking through what a participant would experience if they were in our study. How were they greeted? What happened? What surveys were they given? When were they given them? What procedures happened to them? How were they treated at the end? And how did they actually leave? So the method section has 3 parts: the participants, who they were, the materials, what was actually used, and the procedure, what did you actually do? And the goal of a good method section is to give people enough information that they could approximate your study without having the actual access to the specific materials. The results section is what follows next. It's usually results centered and bolded at the beginning of the section. This is where we'd start with any statistics about the reliability of any measures, though in some cases we might actually find that information in the material section of the methods. We then provide the means and standard deviations of any and all measures, variables that we're going to be using in the hypotheses. This is often presented as a table. This is kind of preliminary analysis. At that point, we're going to get into the actual results, the statistical test for each and every one of the hypotheses. For any relationship between variables, we're going to correctly report those in APA format. And then we're going to, after each one, generally this section will be a hypothesis, the actual statistical results, and then a correct interpretation of the statistics, strength and direction of the relationship, referring back to the actual constructs. This may include graphs, scatter plots, figures of the relationship between those variables. So all of these are going to be in there. If you have any additional analyses beyond your hypotheses, sometimes called exploratory analysis, this would be at the end of this section. We're then going to have a discussion section. Discussion is centered and bolded at the beginning of this section. The first thing we're going to do is reiterate the results in plain English without statistics and stating whether or not our hypotheses were supported. Then we're going to tie those results into the past literature that we discussed in the intro, including new citations. So basically, if there were key studies that we were kind of finding out, do we find the same effect or do we refute that effect? This is where we talk about it. We would also discuss after that any problems or shortcomings in the study. Generally, we're going to be talking about potential issues with internal and external validity. So what were the limitations of this study? And this is often called its own section, limitations. The limitation section should not necessarily be an exhaustive dive of everything that's wrong with your study, but it should at least acknowledge that all studies are weak in some areas. We're then, based on those discussions, that limitation is going to discuss future directions. So basically, we're briefly going to describe some additional studies that could continue the research. Basically, this section is going to be, what would you do different if you were going to do the study again? And finally, a take-home message, a closing statement, a paragraph or paragraphs that leaves the reader with the message of the study. What does all of this mean? This is often best thought of as utility. How could you actually use this information in practice, quote unquote, applying to the real world? And we're finally going to end with a reference section. Again, the references are going to, the name is going to be references, centered and bolded on a new page, and we're going to properly format each reference, matching the citations from the text. So if anything that's cited in the text should be in the reference section, and anything in the reference section should be cited in the text. A lot of times as we write and rewrite a paper, we may actually end up cutting things from it. So we have references that are no longer cited in the text, or we may have a citation in the text that we forgot to do a reference for. This is always a good idea to double check, and it's one of the things journals will often check as well. If you need to know how to actually properly reference something, I suggest going online. Purdue OWL, when the link is somewhere else in this class, is a great resource. But basically, you can also just Google, how do I cite in APA style, and then put in whatever you're trying to cite, whether it's a YouTube video, whether it's someone's lecture, whether it's a Wikipedia site, whether it's a blog entry, and you'll be able to find information on how to properly cite it. So this was just a brief review. I think I go into a little bit more detail in one of the other slide decks talking about APA style, but definitely this is something that you need to learn, not only so that you have a better idea how to write APA style papers, but also to help guide you as you actually read APA style papers in various journals.